The gentle music of a string quartet filled the vast ballroom of the St. Regis, with its crystal chandeliers hanging like sparkling jewels from the high ceiling. The air was heavy with the fragrance of fresh flowers, orchids, lilies, and white roses arranged in lavish displays. It was the kind of event the Montgomerys hosted effortlessly, but this time, something troubled the hosts, the groom. Daniel Brooks stood beside Catherine at the altar, his perfectly tailored black suit a sharp contrast to the stiff and uneasy posture of many of the guests. He barely moved, except to softly squeeze Catherine's hand, the only gesture connecting him to the environment. His eyes, focused on her, radiated confidence, though there was a silent weight in his smile. He knew he was seen as an outsider in this world. In the front row, Victoria Montgomery sat with the impeccable posture of a queen, her fingers lightly touching the armrest of her chair as if this might mask the disgust she felt. Her navy silk dress seemed as meticulously planned as the event itself, but none of it concealed the coldness in her eyes. Beside her, Edward, her husband, adjusted his shirt collar for the third time in under 5 minutes. He had always been more reserved than Victoria, yet he silently disapproved of the marriage. Further back, Benjamin, Catherine's older brother, leaned over to whisper to Charlotte, the family's spirited youngest sibling. "Do you think he borrowed that suit?" Benjamin remarked with a malicious grin. Charlotte chuckled, covering her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand. "Maybe he rented it. Still, it doesn't seem to fit." "Neither does he," Benjamin replied, holding back laughter. From the altar, Catherine overheard the whisper and shot a sharp look at the two, the kind only an older sister could give. Charlotte averted her gaze, but Benjamin simply raised an eyebrow with a smug smile. Catherine knew there was no stopping the remarks. They had always been this way, and she had learned to ignore them. But today, more than ever, their comments hurt. The officiant cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the altar. Catherine turned to Daniel, her eyes meeting his, and everything around her seemed to fade. He was still there, as always, steady, calm, and devoted. This man was her choice, and she knew there wasn't a single argument from her family that could change her mind. "Daniel Brooks," began the officiant, his voice echoing through the ballroom, "do you take Catherine Montgomery as your lawful wife, to love her, to honor her, in good times and bad, in wealth and poverty, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "Yes," Daniel replied, his voice firm but calm. The officiant turned to Catherine. "And you, Catherine Montgomery, do you take Daniel Brooks as your lawful husband, to love him, to honor him, in good times and bad, in wealth and poverty, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "Yes," Catherine said with conviction. The rings were exchanged, and the officiant declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Polite but lukewarm applause echoed through the ballroom. Daniel and Catherine smiled at each other as they shared a gentle kiss. It was a perfect moment for them, and only for them. The night before the wedding had been a prelude to the discomfort Daniel and Catherine knew they would face. The rehearsal dinner took place at the Montgomery Mansion, a property that resembled a museum more than a home. The high ceilings were adorned with gleaming chandeliers, and the walls were covered with artwork by renowned artists. Everything was impeccable, a clear display of the family's status. At the center of the dining room, a long table was set with fine porcelain dishes and polished silverware. Every detail seemed calculated to impress the guests, but for Catherine, it was just another reminder that this world had nothing to do with what she wanted for herself. Daniel sat beside her, calmly listening to the conversations around him. His presence seemed out of place amidst the ostentation, but he remained composed, refusing to show any discomfort. Catherine knew he noticed the evaluating glances, the condescending smiles, and the comments thinly veiled as kindness. "So, Daniel," began Victoria as she delicately cut a piece of meat, "what's it like teaching children?" "I imagine it must be challenging." Daniel raised his eyes, meeting Victoria's. He recognized the malice in the softness of her voice. "It is challenging, yes. But it's also rewarding. Teaching isn't just a profession, it's a calling. Every child is an opportunity to change the future." Victoria smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed her disdain. Admirable, of course. But also, well, limited, don't you think? I mean, there's only so much one can do with such scarce resources. Resources are important, Daniel replied, his tone serene. But what truly matters is the impact you have on people's lives. That's not always something money can measure. Catherine squeezed Daniel's hand under the table as a gesture of support. Victoria noticed but chose not to comment. While Daniel became the target of Victoria's calculated questioning, Catherine couldn't help but remember the days she met Daniel. She had been in a small local bookstore, searching for a book on pedagogy for a project she never ended up completing. The shop had wooden shelves creaking under the weight of old books, and the smell of aging paper mixed with the aroma of coffee from the cafe next door made the place feel cozy. Looking for something specific? Daniel asked, standing behind the counter as he helped the owner that day. Yes, Catherine replied absent-mindedly. A book called Education for Social Transformation. It's not very common. Daniel smiled. Actually, it's one of my favorites. We have a copy here. Catherine was surprised, and even more so when Daniel began discussing the book's content with passion and clarity. His enthusiasm was contagious, and she found herself listening to him longer than necessary. When she left the store that day, she held the book in her hands and his name in her mind. Back at the dinner table, Catherine watched Daniel as he spoke with one of her uncles, who seemed more interested in flaunting his knowledge of the financial market than listening to what Daniel had to say. Even so, Daniel listened patiently, occasionally responding with a polite observation. Charlotte, sitting across the table, glanced at Benjamin before saying, "Daniel, have you ever been to a place like this before? I bet it's quite different from what you're used to." Benjamin laughed, disguising it behind a sip of wine. "Well, at least he seems comfortable. That's a start." Daniel smiled, but Catherine saw the light in his eyes shift, as if his patience was wearing thin. Before he could respond, Catherine intervened. "Perhaps comfort isn't in the place, but in the people. And some people, even in the most luxurious settings, can be extremely unpleasant." The silence that followed was sharp. Benjamin and Charlotte exchanged glances, while Victoria slightly furrowed her brow. Edward cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension. "Well, what's important is that tomorrow will be a special day for everyone. Isn't that what matters?" After dinner, as the guests began to disperse, Catherine and Daniel found a moment alone in the mansion's garden. The soft lights illuminated the stone pathway between perfectly trimmed flower beds, and the cool night air brought welcome relief. "I'm sorry about tonight," Catherine said, stopping to face him. "They were worse than usual." Daniel shook his head, smiling. "You don't have to apologize. I knew it would be like this. They don't know me, Catherine. They don't know who I am. But that doesn't give them the right to judge you," she insisted, with a hint of frustration. Daniel took her hands, intertwining their fingers. "What matters is that you know me. And that you believe in me. That's enough." Catherine felt tears well up, but she blinked them away. "You're stronger than I am, Daniel." He laughed softly. "No, I've just had practice. When you grow up with less, you learn to value what truly matters. And you, Catherine, are what matters." They stood in silence for a few moments, gazing at the stars. To Catherine, this man was everything her family couldn't see: honest, dedicated, and genuine. And that was why she was willing to face it all for him. The morning of the wedding dawned peacefully, with sunlight filtering gently through Catherine's bedroom windows. She sat in front of the mirror at her vanity, gazing at the reflection of her dress. It was a classic, elegant design with delicate lace details cascading over her shoulders. She looked radiant, but her eyes carried a mix of nervousness and determination. As the stylist adjusted her hair, Catherine tried to push away the thoughts circling her mind since the rehearsal dinner. Her mother's coldness, Benjamin and Charlotte's venomous remarks, her father's sympathetic but silent gaze. She knew this wedding wasn't just an event, it was an emotional battlefield. Anna, her best friend and maid of honor, entered the room with a glass of iced tea in hand. "Here, I thought you could use some of this, she said, handing over the glass. Thanks, Catherine replied, accepting the tea. Anna sat beside her, observing her reflection in the mirror. You look amazing. But something tells me your mind is elsewhere. Catherine sighed, placing the glass on the vanity. It's just, my family. They've never accepted Daniel, and I don't know if they ever will. Anna crossed her arms. Catherine, I'm going to say something you might not want to hear. Your family doesn't need to accept Daniel. You do. And, from what I know, you already have. So why worry about them? Because they're my family, Catherine said softly. And despite everything, I wanted them to see what I see in Daniel. He's everything they pretend to value: integrity, hard work, authenticity. Anna leaned forward, taking Catherine's hands. And do you think they're capable of seeing that now? Catherine hesitated. She knew the answer, but admitting it was painful. No, she whispered. Then stop trying to please them. Today is about you and Daniel. Let time show them who he really is. And if they never realize it, that's their problem. Catherine nodded, taking a deep breath. You're right. I'm always right, Anna said with a grin. Now, finish that tea. You have a wedding to shine at. As Catherine continued getting ready, her mind wandered to the more challenging moments in her relationship with Daniel. One particular night stood out in her memory. She had brought Daniel to meet her family at a casual lunch. The table was set in the Montgomery's garden, adorned with fresh flowers and served by waiters offering sophisticated appetizers. Catherine had been nervous but hopeful. The beginning was promising, with Edward being polite and Victoria maintaining her usual froideur. But Benjamin and Charlotte didn't take long to start their remarks. So, Daniel, Benjamin said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Have you ever thought about teaching at a private school? It must be more rewarding. Teaching is rewarding wherever it is, Daniel replied calmly. Charlotte chuckled quietly. It's admirable, but it does seem limited. Doesn't it, Benjamin? Certainly, Benjamin said, gesturing with his wine glass. But maybe it's enough for some. Catherine saw Daniel's jaw tighten, but he stayed calm. When the lunch ended, he thanked them for their hospitality, but Catherine knew the comments had affected him. Later that evening, as they walked through a park together, Catherine apologized. I didn't know they would be so despicable. Daniel finished with a bitter smile. I'm so sorry, she said. Maybe they're right. Maybe you deserve someone who doesn't have to face this. Daniel stopped, turning to her. Catherine, I can't change who I am. And, honestly, I don't want to. But if you choose me, I promise I'll fight to be everything you need. Always. At that moment, Catherine knew she loved him. Now, as she placed the veil over her hair and looked at her reflection once more, Catherine felt the same certainty. Daniel was her choice, and she had no doubt it was the right one. The ballroom at the St. Regis was packed with guests chatting animatedly as the first courses of the reception were served. Daniel and Catherine, seated at the head table, were the center of attention. But the glow in their eyes contrasted sharply with the critical gazes and veiled remarks from many of the attendees. Victoria sat at the family table, accompanied by Edward, Benjamin, and Charlotte. Their commentary was a constant murmur of disdain, an undercurrent that Daniel chose to ignore. He knew he had faced worse in life than the scorn of a family that valued status above all else. Do you think he'll have anything decent to say in his speech? Charlotte murmured, tossing her hair over her shoulder. With any luck, he'll thank Catherine for carrying him, Benjamin replied, stifling a laugh. Victoria, swirling her wine glass, cast a glance toward Catherine and Daniel at the head table. This won't last, she said in a low voice. She's enchanted now, but when reality sets in, she'll see the mistake. Edward sighed, looking more tired than irritated. Maybe he'll surprise you. He seems like a steady man. Perhaps he'll say something that makes sense. Victoria rolled her eyes. I doubt it. When dinner concluded, The moment everyone had been anticipating arrived, the speeches. Catherine was the first to speak, standing with a radiant smile. She thanked everyone for being there and spoke about how Daniel had transformed her life with his kindness and authenticity. Daniel has taught me that true love isn't about what we have, but who we are. He's shown me that the simplest values are actually the grandest. I'm proud to call him my husband. Polite applause followed her speech, though skeptical glances persisted. As Catherine sat down, Daniel slowly rose, taking the microphone. He looked out at the guests calmly, his smile small but confident. "Good evening," he began. "I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate our wedding. This is a very special moment for Catherine and me, and we're grateful to share it with you." He paused, letting the words linger in the air. The ballroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. "I know many of you have doubts about me," he continued. "And that's understandable. After all, I'm a teacher. I don't come from a wealthy family, nor a world of connections and luxury. I chose a simple life because I believe it has more to offer than it appears." Victoria exchanged a satisfied look with Benjamin, as if feeling vindicated. But then Daniel continued. "What you may not know is that my simplicity is not the result of a lack of choices, but a conscious decision. My grandfather, an extraordinary man, believed that wealth is a means, not an end. He left me a considerable fortune, with the condition that I use it for something greater than personal accumulation." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Victoria froze, and Benjamin furrowed his brow, confused. "In recent years," Daniel said, his voice still calm, "I've used that money to fund educational projects and help underserved communities. One of those initiatives, recently, involved funding a trust that saved a company on the brink of bankruptcy. Perhaps this sounds familiar to some of you." He looked directly at Victoria. It was that trust that stabilized one of the supply chains for Montgomery Industries. Without it, things could have turned out very differently. Victoria paled. Benjamin stared at her, perplexed, while Charlotte pressed her lips together. "I'm not saying this to prove anything," Daniel continued. "I'm saying it because I believe we need to look beyond appearances. A person's worth isn't always visible at first glance." The ballroom was utterly silent. Catherine, seated, looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. He was everything she had always known he was, and more. "Today, I'm here because I love Catherine. She saw who I really am and accepted me. For those who can't yet say the same, that's okay. Time is a great teacher. And as a teacher, I know learning can be hard, but it's always worth it." He finished with a small smile, returning the microphone to the master of ceremonies. For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, tentative at first but growing until it filled the room. Victoria sat frozen, clapping mechanically. Her mind raced with the revelation. Benjamin and Charlotte were equally stunned. Catherine reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You were amazing," she whispered. "It didn't take more than the truth," he replied simply. After a long moment, Victoria rose and walked toward the couple. "Daniel," she began, her voice lower than usual. "It seems, we underestimated you." Daniel looked at her with a polite smile. "It seems you did." She hesitated, then extended her hand. "I hope we can talk more in the future." He shook her hand firmly. "I'm always open to conversations, Mrs. Montgomery. As long as they're honest." The reception continued, but the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted. Conversations were quieter, gazes lingered longer, as the guests processed Daniel's revelation. For Catherine, however, everything felt clear. She had always known who he was, and his speech only reaffirmed what she had always seen in him: strength, humility, and purpose. Daniel stood beside her, shaking hands with some of the guests. Many seemed embarrassed by their previous attitudes but still made attempts to redeem themselves. One of the directors of Montgomery Industries shook Daniel's hand vigorously. "Daniel, I didn't know you were behind that trust. Its impact was crucial. Congratulations on the initiative." "Thank you," Daniel replied with his usual calm tone. but the credit belongs to the people who used the resource to make a difference. Victoria watched the interaction from a distance, standing beside Edward. For the first time in years, she seemed unsure, almost uncomfortable. "Did you know anything about this?" she asked her husband. Edward shook his head. "Nothing beyond what you knew. But I'm beginning to think we underestimated him. And maybe Catherine was right about what really matters." Victoria sighed, grabbing a champagne glass from a passing waiter. She knew she needed to speak with Daniel, but admitting she was wrong felt monumental. Later, in a dimly lit corner of the ballroom, Catherine found Benjamin and Charlotte sitting together. Charlotte looked uneasy, while Benjamin maintained the same confused expression he'd worn since Daniel's speech. "So," Catherine began, crossing her arms. "Do you still think he's unworthy?" Charlotte was the first to respond, her voice hesitant. "We didn't know. I mean, he never said anything. How could we have imagined?" "You never asked," Catherine replied, her tone sharp. "You never wanted to know who he really is. All you saw was someone who didn't fit your idea of success." Benjamin finally looked up at her. "He humiliated us," he said, but there was something different in his voice, not anger, but perhaps shame. "He didn't humiliate you, Ben," Catherine replied, softening her tone. "You did that to yourselves. He simply showed there's more to him than you were willing to see." Charlotte fidgeted with her necklace, nervous. "Do you think he'll forgive us?" Catherine gave a faint smile. "Daniel doesn't hold grudges. But he doesn't need your approval, either. Maybe it's time you reflect on what this says about yourselves." Charlotte stayed silent, and Benjamin looked down, deep in thought. Victoria finally approached Daniel, who stood near the head table. Catherine was by his side but stepped away discreetly as she noticed her mother approaching. "Daniel," Victoria began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'd like to speak with you." "Of course," he replied calmly, meeting her gaze. She hesitated for a moment, something she never did. Victoria Montgomery was known for her firm demeanor, but here, standing before Daniel, she seemed smaller. "I have to admit that I underestimated you. I was wrong about you. Catherine seems to see something in you that we didn't, and, well, I wanted to apologize." Daniel remained silent for a moment before responding. "I appreciate your words, Mrs. Montgomery. But more than that, I hope they're sincere. Catherine deserves her family's support, not constant judgment." Victoria nodded slowly. "She's a strong woman. But I see now that she chose someone who matches her strength. I hope we can get to know each other better." Daniel extended his hand. "I hope so, too." As the evening wore on, Catherine and Daniel stole a quiet moment together in the softly lit garden outside. They walked in silence for a while until Catherine stopped and turned to him. "I've always known you were amazing," she said, her smile lighting up her face. Daniel laughed softly. "And I've always known you were the only one who saw it." "They see it now," Catherine said, holding his hands. "It might take them some time to adjust, but I think, deep down, they know I made the right choice." Daniel leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "That never mattered to me. What matters is that you think so." As they embraced under the stars, the distant sounds of the reception echoed through the air. For the first time, Catherine felt that the weight she had carried for so long had lifted. The morning after the wedding arrived with a light mist covering the city. Catherine and Daniel woke up in a small cottage, far from the buzz of the St. Regis, where they had decided to spend their first night as husband and wife. The house was simple, surrounded by tall trees and a small, flower-filled garden. The birds chirping filled the air as sunlight filtered through the curtains. Catherine, still wrapped in the sheets, looked at Daniel with a lazy smile. He sat at the edge of the bed, holding a note she had left on his nightstand before the ceremony. "You're still reading that?" she asked, her voice full of affection. "It's my trophy," he replied, holding up the paper. "I never thought anyone would describe me as a man capable of moving mountains with kindness. I think I'll frame it." Catherine laughed, sitting up and wrapping her arms around his back. You do much more than that. You've changed my life, Daniel. And last night, you proved to everyone that you don't need to be anyone but yourself." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone, Catherine. Only to you. And luckily, I think I already have." She nodded, and the two sat in silence for a moment, savoring the peace of this new chapter in their lives. In the days that followed, Daniel and Catherine began building the life they had always envisioned. Despite Victoria, Benjamin, and Charlotte's attempts at reconciliation, they chose to establish clear boundaries. Family gatherings became less frequent and more cordial, but Catherine knew it would take time for wounds to truly heal. Victoria, in particular, made genuine efforts to change. She invited Catherine to lunches and occasionally sent messages to Daniel, asking about his projects. While Daniel remained polite, he kept his distance, understanding that full acceptance would come only with time. Daniel devoted himself to his social projects with renewed energy. With Catherine by his side, he expanded the educational programs he funded, helping more public schools acquire resources for infrastructure and teaching materials. Catherine, on the other hand, found her passion in collaborating with him, using her expertise in strategic planning to organize events and raise funds. One afternoon, as they worked together at a school Daniel had helped renovate, Catherine paused to watch him. He was surrounded by children, enthusiastically demonstrating how to use a newly acquired microscope. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and the sound of laughter filled the courtyard. "He was born for this," one of the teachers said, approaching Catherine. "The kids adore him. And the impact he's had here, it's something we can never repay." Catherine smiled, feeling a swell of pride she hadn't thought possible. "He's incredible. And that's why I want the world to know him for who he truly is." Later that evening, back at the cottage, Daniel found Catherine sitting in the garden, gazing at the stars. He sat beside her, holding a mug of warm tea. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she replied. "How our lives have changed so quickly. How I finally feel free." Daniel smiled. "Free from what?" "The expectations, the judgments. For so long, I lived trying to please my family, striving for a standard that was never really mine. Then you came along and showed me that I could be more." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You were always more, Catherine. You just needed someone to remind you." They stayed there, under the starry sky, planning their future. They didn't know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but they knew that together, they could face anything. 5 years had passed since the day Catherine and Daniel said "I do" in a ballroom full of skeptical gazes. Now, sitting side by side in a small auditorium at a newly renovated public school, they watched as a group of children performed a play to thank them for the resources they had received. Daniel, as always, wore a proud smile, while Catherine held his hand tightly. "The kids are amazing," Catherine whispered to Daniel. "It's their future that matters," he replied. "We're just helping to pave the way." The event was just another milestone in the work they had built together. Combining Catherine's strategic vision with Daniel's passion for education, they created a foundation that supported underprivileged schools, providing not just materials but also training for teachers and opportunities for students. At the reception after the event, while Daniel spoke with some teachers, Catherine heard her name called. She turned to see her mother, Victoria, approaching with a hesitant smile. Since the wedding, Victoria had made genuine efforts to connect with Catherine and Daniel, but their relationship remained delicate. "Do you have a moment?" Victoria asked, holding a cup of coffee. "Of course," Catherine replied, gesturing for them to sit at a nearby table. Victoria adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit Catherine had recognized since childhood. "I wanted to say how proud I am of what you and Daniel have done. It's admirable, truly. And it's clear you make an incredible team." Catherine raised her eyebrows, surprised by the sincerity in her mother's voice. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me." Victoria hesitated but continued. "I also wanted to apologize again. For all those years of judgment. I think I was afraid. afraid of losing you to a world I didn't understand. But you were right. He is everything you said he was. And more. Catherine felt tears welling up, but she quickly blinked them away. Thank you, Mom. I know it wasn't easy for you. But I'm glad you're here now. The two sat in silence for a moment, sharing a comfortable quiet they hadn't had in years. Later, Catherine found Daniel outside the auditorium, chatting with a group of students. He laughed and joked, completely at ease. When the students dispersed, he turned to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, smiling. "But there's something I need to tell you first." "I'm listening." Catherine held his hands and looked into his brown eyes, the ones that always calmed her. "I don't know if I say this enough, but you've changed my life. Not just how I see the world, but how I see myself. Thank you for showing me what really matters." Daniel smiled softly. "You always had it in you, Catherine." I just held up the mirror. They embraced under the darkening sky, feeling the cool breeze of early evening. In that moment, it was impossible not to feel that, despite the challenges, they had built something true. As they walked to the car, Catherine looked at Daniel and asked, "Do you think we've done enough?" "No," he replied with a smile. "But we're just getting started." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.